Welcome to The Lover's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. You're with Mike
and Ian
as we continue our rereading of the Aubrey Maturin novels of Patrick O'Brien. It's great to be back for our second episode covering the Mauritius Command. Ian, where were we last time and what's coming up this week?
Oh, Mike, it really is great to be back, isn't it? Last time, we kicked off the Mauritius Command with Jack Aubrey coming to terms with domesticated life ashore on half pay. It was not a happy scene. He had to deal with the consequences of caterpillars and a barren cow and his shrewish mother-in-law, Mrs. Williams. His good friend Stephen Maturin had dropped in to share a very badly kept secret that Jack was on assignment as Commodore in charge of a squadron in the Indian Ocean. And meanwhile, Sophie had shown a touch of jealousy when they'd been visited by Lady Clonfert, wife of one of Jack's new subordinates. This time, meanwhile, our hero Jack Aubrey is moving from the frustrating confines of shore life right back to where he belongs, in command at sea. He's exchanging the complexities of land for the complexities of the quarterdeck, but as we'll see, he hasn't entirely escaped his troubles at home. We have a new ship, a new crew, an early prize, and some changes in the makeup of the crew surrounding Jack and Stephen, not to mention a guest to be tolerated in the captain's cabin. Mike, let's get into it.
Oh, this sounds wonderful, Ian. I love it. We're going to be back at sea. And we really are back at sea. We began very much with this transition for Jack to commanding HMS Boadicea, which sets this story now in motion fully here. Speaking of the Boadicea, after the detailed introduction we got to the beloved Surprise in the previous book, HMS Surprise, I have to say we don't get as much descriptive detail about the Boadicea's character here, at least not yet. So I guess, hey, we just met this lady. So, but we do know she's a 38-gun frigate, which is a decent command for Jack, moving him past this small sloop stage here.
And by the way, Mike, which of us in our careers hasn't burned with ambition to get past the small sloop stage, right? Right. We've all been there.
we have indeed, Ian. Oh, boy, I could just meet a 38-gun frigate tonight.
Yeah.
Oh, my. Well, we're going to be setting off from Plymouth, headed for the British station at Cape Town. And Jack, of course, as we can only imagine, is bursting with excitement, eager about this new mission, but also understandably a little uncertain. He's been assigned to coordinate a mission to reduce the French possessions in the Indian Oceans, specifically, and my apologies to French people around the world, Ile Bourbon, otherwise Réunion or Ile Bonaparte, and the Mauritius, otherwise Ile de France.
Very good. Oh, solid 9.5 out of 10. And Mike, there's lots of interesting historical context to this expedition to the Indian Ocean. We'll hear about that in a second. But staying with Jack's situation for a moment, his orders require him to attend to a bunch of general directions attached as schedules to his orders. And critically, he's directed to seek the advice of William Farquhar, Esquire, the governor-designate, or, in the absence of Farquhar at any stage in the proceedings, Dr. Stephen Maturin. He's recommended to take the advice of Farquhar and of Maturin in all political matters and those concerning contact with the civil population. I'm like, this is a big development for Stephen. We don't know very much about what he's done since HMS Surprise, but he's certainly now in the story and in the context here, way beyond that of a ship surgeon who dabbles in espionage and public affairs. He's part of the political establishment. Farquhar has been picked up at Plymouth along with the orders. So the mission is set, the political advice is all on board, and Stephen Maturin is an important part of the picture.
Well, Ian, that's what's happening on the written page from Patrick O'Brien. But take us into the real world a little bit here. In the real world, what's going on?
Thank you. Yeah, it's fascinating. The naval action for this whole campaign that's described here in the Mauritius Command is taken pretty directly from the history of a real campaign in the Indian Ocean aimed at taking back control of Mauritius in 1809 to 1810. And just as closely as Master and Commander built on the Cochrane campaign, so is this story built on the details of that Mauritius campaign. Now, we'll hear more about the individual commanders in the squadron later on, But I can say right now, two of them, namely Jack Aubrey and Lord Clonfert, are fictionalized and are different in important ways from the men who were their counterparts in the real world story. But the others, named Bertie, Pym, and Corbett, are based very closely on the real historical captains of the same name. So if you ever fancy Googling what was going on, you'll see links to captains with those names, and the story compares pretty directly. So, whereas Jack Aubrey was manifesting Thomas Cochrane in the first book or two, he's manifesting a different character now. Josias Rowley, who was a distinguished British naval officer. He originated from an influential naval family that included his grandfather, the Admiral of the Fleet, Sir William Rowley. And aided by his family connections, Rowley had become a lieutenant really early at the age of 18, back in 1783. Wow. He was a post captain by 1795. So in seniority, quite a long way ahead of Cochrane. And the real world Rowley then was a little bit older and a little bit better connected, you would say, than Jack Aubrey when Rowley came to hoist his broad pennant as a Commodore in 1809. So, Mike, that's the naval situation. Do you want to give us a flavor of what was happening in the rest of the world?
Yeah, Ian, to catch us up a little bit more on the political and naval situation generally, all right, Napoleon has never quite given up on the idea of supplanting Britain's strong position as the colonial occupier of much of India. He'd appointed two men to maintain a presence in the Indian Ocean with the aim, at the very least, interfering with the British East India Company and possibly also of extending French territorial influence. One of these was Captain Jacques Hamelin, who also appears in this story and was the senior French naval commander in the region at that time. And an even more important one, from the point of view of this campaign, was Major General Charles de Caen, an ardent Bonapartist who was governor and military commander of French forces in the Indian Ocean, which at that time meant Mauritius, La Réunion, and Rodriguez. And he was there from 1803 to 1810. Now, we don't hear much about de Caen directly in the text of this story, but his tenacity and Anglophobia played an important role in the French strategy for defeating the British.
Right. His character reminds me of the characters in Monty Python's Life of Brian, who say they really hate the Romans. De Caen really hated the British. So we'll see some signs of that as the story goes on. So thanks, Mike. We're seeing then that the islands themselves were strategically important to both sides for the course of the war. Capturing them from French influence is the narrative thread that underlines the whole book. And if the French had a really zealous and clear-eyed leader in the person of de Caen, things were a little bit murkier on the British side. The three main possessions, cities or territories on the Indian subcontinent were Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. And nowadays you would call them Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai. But the governor or president representing the East India Company and thereby Britain in each of these three places was a powerful figure, each in their own right. And there were intense personal rivalries between and among these men. And it made for a really lawless Wild West feel in some respects in this territory at the time.
Wow. Well, it's interesting, Ian, that this behavior and culture of British expats in these three colonies is kind of hinted at already in HMS Surprise. We had jealousy, sexual intrigue, cutthroat ambition, pretty much the order of the day. And in the years prior to this campaign, Admiral Sir Edward Pellew had been at the center of some of this, trying to keep the peace between the local governors, the guys you were just mentioning, the local military commanders, and the East India Company itself.
Right. We love Pellew, by the way. He's a really, really solid character. There's lots to read about Pellew. He features a lot in the Hornblower stories, not so much in person in the O'Brien stories. But anyway, this guy Pellew, very solid, diplomatic, meritocratic commander, had been trying to rein in the behavior of a notorious flogging captain called Richard Corbett. That's right, Corbett, who appears in the fictional story that's told by O'Brien. Corbett had been able to get away with some pretty tyrannical acts of cruelty over his crew with the help of some cover, or at least a blind eye being turned by the local, more junior admiral, a guy called Admiral Bertie, who of course appears in this book as well. Bertie was the commander-in-chief of the Cape of Good Hope station. Now, in the real world, Corbett had been the subject of at least 2 attempted mutinies by his exasperated crews in the months leading up to Rowley's arrival. And Corbett, albeit with his name spelled a little differently, and Bertie are both going to feature in this story, but we don't get to see the backstory of Corbett and his shenanigans around the maltreatment of his crew. And meanwhile, Mike, the East India Company was in financial crisis. 2 of the company's homebound fleets had been ravaged either by hurricanes or by the predations of Hamelin's cruisers. In the winter of 1808-1809, there had been dozens of lives lost, millions and millions of pounds worth of cargo and shipping lost. And the East India Company, this great kind of paragon of British imperialism, shining and elegant though it was actually heavily in debt and in some respects was on the verge of collapse at around this time.
It's interesting, Ian. I think that O'Brien kind of hinted at this just in a nod and a wink when Jack in chapter 1 had said, Stephen, is this one of these things that's just come up and then it's going to go away? And Stephen's like, no. These guys on the Admiralty board, yeah, they're pretty heavily invested here and they are not going to let this happen. So I think you're all over. It's great to have that history as well. So now in the spring of 1809, as the Mauritius Command begins, Pellew has gone home, right? And Bertie still is securely in place at the Cape. And in the real world, Rowley, like Aubrey, has taken command of a mixed squadron of frigates, elderly line of battleships, and smaller craft. And Deccan is determined that the English should not get their perfidious hands on Mauritius.
That was my best attempt at a perfidious laugh, but I don't know if I liked it.
I kind of liked it.
So, Mike, you and I were talking before the show about how much there is sometimes to tell about the real world. We try to share as much of this stuff as we can in every episode, but sometimes there's just more than we can find time for. And that's one of the ways we like to work with our Patreon supporters. We occasionally post articles and media about topics that didn't quite make it fully into the show. For example, last week, we posted a little extra piece about the Cretins of Bohea, especially for our Patreon supporters. We also, I think, shared it more widely online, but that's the kind of thing that we like to share with our Patreon supporters. If you'd like to join our band of Patreon brothers and sisters, please head over to patreon.com/lubbershole and explore all the different tiers and benefits that there are there. We're eternally grateful to the folks who support us there. Some of them have been around for months and years helping to bring the Lubber's Hole to life. And in addition to extra tidbits from the show, Patreon supporters get ad-free access to all of our episodes, and they get regular updates on what's going on from Ian and Mike. And please check it out. We'd love to welcome you on board. So, Mike, with the benefit of our Patreon supporters, we're ready to move ahead here. Shall we get more deeply into the stories at the beginning of chapter 2 here?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea, Ian. So the actual action in this chapter really begins quickly, almost immediately after sailing. And it's we're hearing about it as so often in O'Brien after the fact. The Boadicea has had already what the chapter summary called an initial success. What's happened there?
Well, this sets the perfect tone for Jack's return to command. We were saying in the last episode that we were all a bit uncertain about where this was going to go. Reassurance, if you wanted it, that Jack is all set to resume his mantle of a successful commander. We're looking over his shoulder in this opening passage. It's page 54 in the Norton edition. And he's dictating a formal letter to his clerk, always an indicator of a successful action. He says, Boadicea at sea, Sir in the singular, addressed to all of the Admiralty in general, I have the honour to acquaint you that at dawn on the 17th instant, His Majesty's ship under my command had the good fortune to fall in with a French national ship of war with a prize in company. Great news, eh, Mike?
Oh, prize! Lucky Jack. Is Lucky Jack back? Let's sure hope so. Here we are, first paragraph of this chapter. And we're there. I mean, we learned that the French warship sees Jack approaching, abandons her prize, tries to escape. She's still, been a little bit beaten up from the original prize taking. And she tries to lead the Boadicea into the shoals, thinking this idiot English captain is going to ground her. He doesn't know this thing. But we got a little luck and a little of Jack's skill. Jack had actually, we know that Jack likes to go out there and, do the soundings and all the geographical observations. He'd been through here before. He knew exactly how this thing laid out. And the French ship misses stays and strikes a reef. So, Ian, let's turn to the sailor on this show. There's only one of us, the real sailor. For our audience, tell us about missing stays in plain language.
Well, it means failing to successfully execute the maneuver of tacking. And tacking is a maneuver of turning the ship's head so that the bow goes through head to wind onto a new course. And this is a risky maneuver that if you don't do it quickly and smartly, you get stuck head to wind. And that's exactly what missing stays means. People also use the phrase in irons, which means exactly the same thing. Stuck with everything flapping, with the sails all pointing the wrong way, head to wind, and then starting to make way backwards. You're stuck there. You're unable to steer. You're certainly not in control. And this is exactly what happened to the ship that was being pursued by Jack. The ship struck a reef. And the name of the ship, it turns out, to the French, she was known as the Hebe. I think that's how I would say it, Hebe. But to British, she was known by her former name, HMS Hyena, a 28-gun frigate that had been captured by the French. She mounts 22 24-pounders, carronades. She mounts 2 long nines. It's pretty good armament. She's been boarded and carried by Boadicea's boats in a successful action. At least it appeared pretty successful, led by Jack's first lieutenant, Lemuel Akers, a man whom Jack describes as an old and deserving officer. At least that's how he described him in the dispatches. Unfortunately, the casualties were really light. Only 2 men slightly wounded. So things are looking up here, right?
Well, looking up indeed, not only this enemy ship and a recaptured British ship at that, but also the prize they rescue is a Snow, a type of merchant vessel whose topmasts were struck down. And the capture is great for the ship for continuity too, because they get to pick up some English able seamen who'd been prisoners aboard the Hebe. They also capture a French cook along with a great deal of money in terms of the cargo of this merchant vessel.
Right. And not only have they got the great cook, and by the way, also the cook's master's supply of French delicacies.
Right.
They've got all this prize money coming toward them as well. And this is looking great, but Jack bemoans in his correspondence with Sophie, I think, and probably also in conversation with Stephen, the fact that the admiral in this case that he's sailing under had cut himself in on the prize money by adding the admiral's own orders over the top of the ones that Jack had received directly from headquarters, from the Admiralty. And I know we had said earlier on that O'Brien is heading away from the world of Cochrane in this book, but this particular circumstance of a port admiral cutting in on your prize money may well have been inspired by a real experience that Thomas Cochrane had in 1805, at a time not recorded in the annals of Patrick O'Brien, but certainly recorded in all the biographical details of Thomas Cochrane. In early 1805, he was in command of the frigate Pallas. And Cochrane wrote in his autobiography, the admiralty orders were embargoed by the port admiral, who had taken upon himself to recopy them, and thus to convert them into orders issued under his authority. The effect was to enable him, he means the port admiral, to lay claim to the admiral's share of any prize money that we might take. And in that situation, in the real world, on that cruise, Cochrane went on to capture about £130,000 worth of gold, silver, and cash from a series of Spanish prizes. That's £130,000 in money of the day, worth millions upon millions nowadays. And that particular port admiral's greed paid off, and it really rankled with Cochrane. One more thing to say about Cochrane before we turn back to our story, Mike. That particular time in the Palace, Cochrane went on to do a couple more Jack Aubrey tricks. He used his famous lantern on a raft trick that he had used in the Mediterranean, which appears in the Peter Weir movie. And he also used Jack Aubrey's trademark hawsers to the mastheads trick to outrun some chasing French ships. So we're away from Cochrane, but we're not that far away from Cochrane.
Yeah. And we've got this action that's already happened, and we're learning about it. We've got Jack writing his, letter back to the Admiralty, his official letter. He's also writing to Sophie, and it's fascinating, and we'll see in a minute. He's then talking to Stephen. how the story changes and we learn a little bit more and what's kind of truth and what's kind of fiction, or at least reported differently. So we see now coming up in Jack's official letter, Jack praising the first lieutenant, who now is going to be sent off with the prize. And there's a significant career move in the works here for a junior officer, Mr. Johnson, a master's mate who actually had, in fact, displayed great activity, who's promoted to acting lieutenant. Guy that's been around for a very long time, didn't have influence, the kind of guy Jack likes. He actually has merit, no influence. And Jack is like, let's do this and hope that the admiral will confirm it when we get to our station here. Jack then actually later receives back confirmation of the commission, which provides an even increased fresh dose of pleasure. And I love this, not just because we get to see Jack in his let's go with merit over influence role, but also looking at the way these youngsters, if you will, one of them not so young, but he'd been in that role for a very long time, come in and are looking at Aubrey. And Jack is thinking about himself at that age, being called into the captain when the ship really, despite all he'd written to the Admiralty, hadn't done so well. And these guys waiting to get told off about how they hadn't done so well. But instead, they're getting promoted. And then we'll get into, they get the Jack version of now, so here's how it's going to be from now on. And the reason I'm putting you in this place. And Jack is kind of looking at them wondering, because he's thinking they're really worried they're going to get disciplined. But what O'Brien tells us is these guys are looking at Jack in awe because they know his reputation. And then this finally comes out that, oh no, sir, I was this when I saw you come in with a cacafuego and Jack, we get immediately too from O'Brien this great thing about Jack's personality and Jack's character. Like, Jack doesn't think of himself as a great man. He thinks of himself really kind of lucky Jack, not lucky just because of the prize money, but lucky because he happened to be at the right place at the right time, and that anybody else in the Navy would have done the same thing. Not that, in fact, there are a lot of people that wouldn't have done, which kind of sets up what comes right after this here.
Exactly, Mike. As the voyage proceeds, the early action and the taking of the prize is followed by a bit of a happy period, a time for some training and some growth in the crew. But the major tension here in chapter 2 isn't really about the battle that they've just fought. It's about the weight, the burden that Jack is carrying and is going to carry more of when it comes to dealing with his subordinates. Specifically, we're introduced at second hand to the looming figure of Lord Clonfert. Now, Clonfert, commander of one of the smaller, if not the smallest ship in the squadron, is portrayed as a problematic character, and no spoilers, he's going to be a tough challenge for Jack in terms of leadership. We get an exploration of Clonfert's character without meeting him, but through a series of flashbacks that are described as Jack is talking to Stephen. Stephen has his own astute analysis here, and we learn about how Jack had encountered Clonfert all these career stages earlier. Now, we're going to hear a lot about the awkwardness in the relationship between Jack and Clonfert. But before we get into all of that, Mike, let's just pick up on what we've already heard about in this book. Jack might have got himself into a little bit of a hot or awkward situation with Lord Clonfert already, right?
Right. I mean, Jack's written to Sophie, and Stephen says, "What did you mention what you did with Lady Clonfert?" And Jack more or less admits his chicanery in sneaking out of his obligation to give Lady Clonfert passage. Jack says, "I merely stated that she did not appear at the rendezvous and passed on," is all Jack said. And Stephen says, nothing about the 3 o'clock in the morning, the hocus pocus at the end, signals disregarded, the boat being made to row as though we were escaping from the day of judgment, and the lady ditched. So Stephen says this, and O'Brien writes, with the unpleasant creaking noise that was his nearest approach to a laugh. "What a rattle you are, to be sure," said Jack. "But come now, Stephen, how is your patient?" He's going to talk about, the captured lieutenant of this ship. But, here is Jack, and we're going to get, as you said, Ian, this peeling back of what do we know about Clonfert? What's the history between Clonfert and Jack? but we see that he's already stepped in it. I mean, Lady Clonford's down there with all her stuff waiting to go, and Jack intentionally didn't bring her.
Oh, it's funny, Mike. I'm hearing you give the quick summary of Stephen asking, what did you do with Lady Clonford? I'm thinking there's another version of the character of Jack Aubrey where you might really raise your eyebrows at the question, but he had sidestepped
Right.
with giving Lady Clonford a lift. Of course, clearly to absolve himself from any jealousy or suggestion of misconduct in the eyes of Sophie. But actually,
Exactly.
it makes his reflection on the awkwardness of his past relationship with Clonford even more tricky. Clonford, as Jack explains to Stephen, has got a dangerous kind of ambition about him, a lack of moral compass. I think so, at some point Jack says, I don't know whether either to believe that he was a bit of a stumbling incompetent or he was a bit shy. And I think he also missed out the possible accusation that Clonford might be a bit vain and a bit self-seeking. In the broader context, Clonford is described as believing that truth was what he could make others believe. I think that's a phrase that's going to come in the book. But we know from the beginning of the novel that Jack was already concerned about the delicate command issue awaiting him in this squadron, involving not only Clonford, but also Corbett and also Captain Pym. Now, this slightly vainglorious, slightly performative character of Clonford is somebody that we're already starting to feel a bit negative towards. But besides that worry, Mike, Jack's got other worries as well about his status as a commander and about his relationship with the other people on board.
Yeah, I just love this, that, we've got this whole thing that we're going to peel off in layers about Clonford. And then there's this other human condition theme, the theme of command, the difficulty of commanding peers. Jack's a very enthusiastic commander, but he faces this impending rivalry and potential insubordination we've already heard historically about some of the characters that we've got waiting for him there. And Stephen's role, which grows significantly here, as they're sailing along, he's working with Farquhar to develop political strategies. And Farquhar is kind of leveraging his role as His Majesty's Governor Delegate or proxy for the upcoming campaign. And it's not quite the level that, our dignitary had on the Surprise, because if they win militarily, then they could make him governor. But that's a big if here. We'll talk a little bit more about Jack and his concern about these people who are God the Father on their own ships, and how are they going to listen to Jack when he gets there and tries to tell them. And I can't help but think in my own mind, it's Jack's a guy who gets things done, and that's a very different thing than getting things done through other people when you're sitting back and they're doing the doing, not you doing the doing.
And we've got somebody on board who is, in a way, is there to represent the doing of things via other means. Somebody to be the political representative. This guy, Governor Farquhar, governor to be. He gets mentioned, first of all, in the connection of him and Stephen both having a strong negative reaction to their encounter with the margins of slavery as was happening on one of the ships that they captured. But there's more than that to say about Farquhar. He's this odd mixture of somebody who's personally agreeable, but also rather hard to like. And O'Brien says, Jack esteemed him as an intelligent, capable, gentlemanlike man with remarkable powers of conversation, excellent company for the space of a dinner, although he drank no wine, or even for a week. But Mr. Farquhar had been bred to the law, and perhaps because of this, a little too much of his conversation took the form of questioning, so that Jack sometimes felt he was being examined at his own table. Furthermore, Mr. Farquhar often used Latin expressions that made Jack uneasy. And Mike, this is fun for the characterization of Farquhar, but really rewarding from the point of view of characterization of Jack and Stephen, right?
Yeah, it really is. And I love how, O'Brien does such a beautiful job of saying, oh, Farquhar's got this, Farquhar's got that. Jack really doesn't like this. Jack doesn't like that. He reads all these books and Jack isn't familiar with them. But then O'Brien's pointing out that, yep, Stephen does that and Jack loves him. Stephen also does that and Jack loves him. And Stephen does this and Jack loves him. But there is one thing that comes back here, and O'Brien uses it as one of those exposition moments to recount Jack and Stephen's first meeting and their love of music. And that turns out to be kind of the fatal personality flaw for Farquhar is you've got all this other stuff and I can forgive all that. And even Stephen's a little pissed that his, Farquhar's so good at chess and like,
Yes.
that's like that. But by God, music's really important. So Ian, is this Farquhar, is he from the historical account as well? And what's going on with Farquhar and Jack and Stephen and music here?
Oh, Mike, thank you. It's a great question. Both the name and the character and the role are consistent with the historical record. So there was a British governor designate sent with Rowley Squadron to Mauritius, and his name was Farquhar. We don't know much more about his character than that. So the rest of it is O'Brien's delicious fictionalizing of this person to play this role alongside Jack and Stephen. And of course, as you say, it's character death. Alongside Marine lieutenants playing the German flute in the wardroom, we've got Farquhar, who has not a thing to say about music. In fact, he had said one evening that he was as indifferent to Haydn as he was to Mozart. As he observed, he would not give a farthing candle for either of them or for Handel. This little throwaway remark attributed to Farquhar is a lovely Easter egg if you choose to dig into it. A famous piece, a doggerel poem written by an essayist named Charles Lamb in the early 19th century, was called Free Thoughts on Several Eminent Composers. And it's a jolly little satirical set of jokes and name drops about classical music. And there's a set of rhyming couplets. It goes, some cry up Haydn, some Mozart, just as the wind bites. For my part, I do not give a farthing candle for either of them, nor for Handel. So, ho, ho, ho. Well done, Charles Lamb. O'Brien clearly remembered this and dropped it in to the mouth of Farquhar. Lamb's perspective on music, at least as he expresses it in this poem, is a bit Philistine, to be honest. Beethoven, Weber, Gluck, Purcell, all great composers, all come under Lamb's withering fire. Lamb had died in 1834, which makes the poem probably a bit anachronistic for 1809, but never mind. It's fun, Mike, if we track all the way to the end of Lamb's poem. He saves the biggest names for the end. And O'Brien and, by extension, Stephen and Jack would be, I think, rolling their eyes at this. He says, I would not go 4 miles to visit Sebastian Bach or Bach. Which is it? No more I would for Bononcini. As for Novello or Rossini, I shall not say a word to grieve 'em, because they're living. So I leave 'em. So, there you go. If you're interested, you can go online and look for Charles Lamb's thoughts on several eminent composers, but I think you can leave his cynicism at the door, right?
Yeah. It's great. And I love that. O'Brien, we know throughout the canon does this a number of times. He finds something that he wants to quote or use, but hasn't happened yet. So he'll stick it in somebody else's mouth, or he'll say, well, I think I heard somebody once say something about, so nicely done. Part of this attention to detail. And you kind of wonder, again, I come back to this so often. This is pre-internet. How does this guy have all this on his brain and his bookshelf and he grabs all this stuff? It's so wild. Well, this attention to detail, part of O'Brien's craft. So we're up here. We've set up the structure of the campaign. We've got the excitement of the new campaign. We've got the confidence gained by an easy victory, juxtaposed by the rising tension about, personal dynamics, the future command dynamics with difficult captains. We know historically there's a number of them here, but Clonford's kind of front and center here. And I love this O'Brien. It's classic narrative technique, triumph and apprehension, back and forth, back and forth.
Absolutely, Mike. And as they sail on through the South Atlantic, the long journey gives Jack the perfect opportunity to focus on bringing the Boadicea's crew up to his own high standards of gunnery and efficiency. That's the core of his command style. We're going to hear more about what he's doing, especially with the midshipmen, later on. But for now, I think we can bring our own gunnery up to the highest possible standards by stepping away for a moment, grabbing something refreshing, and taking a short break. See you in a moment.
welcome back. Before the break, we covered this prompt initial action where the Boadicea had captured the Hebe and her snow prize. Now let's talk a little bit about what Jack did with that success before pressing ahead. Let's look back again because it highlights his command philosophy immediately and also tells us a little bit about where some of that prize money is going to go here. I think the prize money is definitely going back home, and that was the letter we mentioned to Sophie, and he's kind of saying, "Here's all the things we could use around the house, and all the things I want you to do for yourself with some of what we've got going on here." So that part I loved. That was really nice. Jack doesn't just take that prize, he uses the prize taking process as a quick and brutal means of personnel management and starts getting rid of the chaff, shall we say, in his crew right away.
Yeah, and we've encountered this challenge of Jack's before, but he's thinking about it hard and he's thinking about it far ahead, and he's taking advantage of this moment with the transfer of prize crew to take care of something that is this manning issue is going to be important all the way through this campaign. It was in the real world, and so it shall be for Jack. They're a long way away from home. They're even going to be a long way away from the Cape of Good Hope once they're out there in the Indian Ocean. All of these captains in the Indian Ocean are going to be, and were in fact, chronically short of hands. And maybe this is a little bit of a plant as a setup for later, Mike. Jack may soon wish that he hadn't been so free in getting rid of all of the chaff, as we've called them. And let's drop a little hint and say he maybe is going to be pleasantly surprised at who turns up looking for an intership transfer in just 1 or 2 chapters from now. So he's dictated this letter that sends this captured ship, the Hebe, or the former Hyena, and their prize, the Snow, off to Gibraltar with the prize crew. And let's take a look at how he handles some of his personnel issues by making the assignment for who's the crew for the long trip to Gibraltar.
Yeah, he sends away everybody he doesn't want. Brian writes that Jack watched with, as he says, real satisfaction as 8 undesirables departed. The text says 8 sodomites, 3 notorious thieves, 4 men whose wits were quite astray, and a parcel of invertebrate stalkers and sea lawyers go off for good. And it's a brutal but necessary part of crafting this fighting ship, the Boadicea here.
And it's trademark O'Brien craft as well, I think, in a funny way that he's writing. 4 men whose wits were quite astray, the inveterate skulkers and sea lawyers. We get the trademark dry humor. We also get another reference to a certain kind of tyranny. He ships off a great lout of a midshipman who had made the youngsters' lives a burden to them, which is another way for Jack to settle the social context of the family of the ship. And he gives the prize master, this guy, Lieutenant Akers, the chance to earn a promotion away from a difficult crew. However, he's also managing to not inflict Akers on his own ship and crew because he's not a big fan of Akers. Despite having written highly of him in the additional letter, we learn that Akers had a bit of an ill temper. He had a pain in his leg. He takes his anger out on the crew. And worse than that, and worse than the flogging, he's no seaman. Jack had come on deck partway through the cruise and found things all badly ahoo in the cable department, cost them time to get away, and Jack has got no place aboard any of his ships for anybody who's got that kind of lack of seamanship alongside the anger and the inefficiency.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me that, remembering back in chapter 1, Ian, that Jack, who was like talking about slavery, talking about in this chapter a little earlier going, but it would be nice to have some biddable people who will do whatever you say back home, who was in chapter 1 talking about, well, I can run a ship's company and I never have any flogging, but a little flogging here at home might not be a bad idea. So here we go. That idea of a little bit of tyranny back home is now going straight back to being the humane, meritocratic leader that we know and love.
So, Mike, there's still a bit of tyranny going on board the Boadicea. The tyranny in this case is reserved for the people Jack loves to brutalize the most, and that's the midshipmen. Now, amongst several other mundane duties, the midshipmen are assigned at one point to stand there with broom handles and support Jack's unsuccessful experiments with balancing his telescope, all to no avail, because as the text says, his telescope was a disappointment. It was not that he could not see Jupiter, The planet gleamed in his eyepiece like a banded gold pea. But because of the ship's motion, he could not keep it there long enough or steadily enough to fix the local time of its moon's eclipses and thus find his longitude. Now, Mike, it's great that Jack is trying to pass on his passion for astronomy. He's passing it on to the midshipmen, showing them the new sights, because, of course, what's above you in the sky changes as you go past the equator. And there's another great piece of writing here. He says, southward still, with Canopus and Achernar high overhead, and Jack showed his attentive midshipmen the new constellations, Musca, Parvo, Chameleon, and many more, all glowing in the warm, pellucid air. And here is yet another really great Easter egg for us. These southern constellations, it's interesting that he chose these three in particular. Musca, the fly, Parvo, the peacock, and Chameleon, the chameleon, are among 12 particular southern constellations that were first noticed and identified and named by a Renaissance astronomer called Petrus Plancius. And they first appeared on a 35 centimeter diameter celestial globe published by Plancius in around 1600 in Amsterdam. So this is a very ancient piece of astronomical text. And this globe, well, I wonder, Mike, whether O'Brien might have had a copy of the globe sitting on his desk, or maybe had seen the copy of it that's held in the Royal Maritime Museum in Greenwich. And we'll share with you later on a link to where you could see this particular globe. Really nice that you think, by seeing this combination of three constellations, you can kind of spot the source that O'Brien might have used. As you say, Mike, back in the day when there was no internet. I'll do one little bit more of astronomy nerdery, which is it's a bit of a stretch to describe Achernar as showing high overhead, since it's only just going to be above the horizon, even at its highest, when you're at the latitude of Cape Town. But never mind, we can forgive O'Brien that one.
Well, we know that O'Brien was writing back and forth with Mary Renault to get kind of the lay of the land for Cape Town. I guess he didn't check out exactly where the constellations were with her.
Right.
Well, speaking of astronomy, Ian, we skipped past Miss Caroline Herschel last time, another female character who could, among other things, arouse Sophie Aubrey's jealousy. But, Jack had, after all, called her an admirable woman. But a few of you noticed that and pointed it out in our social media channels. So in order to pick up on that, let's stop and take a quick look at some of your other comments since our last episode.
Yeah, let's do that. Kind of listener post bag. So, Mike, I'm going to start out with somebody who shares the first name as me. Ian Harding, one of our great Patreon supporters, was just happy that we were getting started with Chapter 1 of Mauritius Command. And thinking about the reputation that the book has, Ian says, I always felt this one never quite got the kudos that it's due. It's an outstanding novel, says Ian, if you nerd out on the naval side of the novels. I think I would say, Ian, we are with you. And so is our next listener. Tell us about that one, Mike.
Yeah, Russ Harden on Facebook said, 20 years ago, I wouldn't have counted it as a favorite. When I picked it up and reread it 3 years ago, I got so much more out of it, and now it's one of my top three. Russ, I've got to say that I think Ian and I are having a little bit of that exact same experience here. Thank you.
Right. Very good. We have some listeners on YouTube who comment really reliably. Welcome to all of you. Broadsword6650. Hello to you, Broadsword. Wanted to talk about our coverage of Jack's attitude to children and to women. And he says, Jack's attitude towards babies and women regarding the former as subhuman and the latter as encumbrances, complicated encumbrances, seems actually in character. And I love this description that Broadsword gave us of Jack. He says, at this point, Jack is not a family man. He's simply a man with a family. Brilliant turn of phrase, brilliant description of Jack in his stage of life. He feels superfluous in his own home, adrift and all a who. He's disappointed that he doesn't have a son. He feels that the recent circumstances of his life, including a non-existent sex life, by the way, have left him on a metaphorical lee shore. His acceptance of all of that with no extramarital shenanigans is remarkable. Very good, very fair analysis towards Jack Aubrey. Broadsword goes on and finishes off saying, the reappearance of Stephen and the associated new command are life-saving to Jack. It also saves his marriage and possibly even prevents him from strangling his mother-in-law. it takes a lot, right, to get any grown man to avoid strangling Mrs. Williams. I think we can forgive him, says Broadsword, for a few less than warm-hearted comments about children. Very well said. A glass of wine with you, Mr. Broadsword, sir, assuming that you're a Mr. and a sir.
Yeah. Paul Tomlin asked where and how we got a reference to the sea fencibles in chapter 1. And you are absolutely right, Paul. They're mentioned a lot more in Desolation Island. We've heard them some in earlier books, but not in this one. Sorry. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, good job. And now let's talk about Caroline Herschel for a second. Another romantic sounding screen name, Cashman Engineering Products, wrote to us on Facebook to say, I wonder whether in writing about Caroline Herschel that O'Brien was giving a nod to Mary Renault. And Mike, you and I had not thought about this before, and it's a great thought. Mary Renault, they're kind of distant, more experienced, luminary of the literary world, giving a bit of gentle encouragement to her protege on the other side of the world. It's a really, really interesting analogy. Mike, what do we know about Mary Renault?
Well, Mary Renault was actually Eileen Mary Challand. She used the pen name Mary Renault, possibly because the topics that she was writing about were not ones that necessarily were going to be well received by the public at the time. She's a British writer, best known for her historical novels set in ancient Greece. After graduating in 1928, she worked as a nurse and began writing her first novels, which were contemporary romances. Then in 1948, she's been writing all this time, she moved to Durban, South Africa with her life partner, Julie Millard, and then later to Cape Town, where she spent the rest of her life. She was living in South Africa because she wanted to write openly gay characters without fearing the censorship and homophobia of England. At the time they were published, her works were among the few novels to present love between persons of the same sex as kind of a natural part of life rather than a problem. She devoted herself to writing historical fiction in the 1950s, which was also her most successful books. She's best known for that historical fiction today. Her works are often rooted in themes related to love, sexuality, and relationships. Her books attracted a large gay following at the time of their publications when few mainstream works depicted homosexuality in a positive light. Her work has also had a generally positive reception by critics of all ilks. She's received numerous awards and honors both during her lifetime and after her death. And she did draw, we mentioned the people that picked it up in the gay population. She had a very, very wide readership. As a matter of fact, when asked who his favorite author was, John F. Kennedy, you will remember the U.S. president replied simply Mary Renault. So,
wow.
Yeah. I mean, this is a woman who I have to admit, I have not read her books, but I have always known about her because of the historical fiction. I actually did not know the other side, how her personal life was interwoven in here. But it was fascinating. I think her Alexander trilogy was one of the first mainstream literary works to feature homosexual relationships prominently. But she turned away from writing in the 20th century, which she had been doing with that genre, and writing stories about male lovers in warrior societies of ancient Greece. So she no longer had to deal with homosexuality and anti-gay prejudice as social problems. Instead, she was free to consider larger ethical and philosophical concerns while examining the nature of love and leadership. So, many critics talk about that, and I immediately said, now, I wonder why she and O'Brien were such good friends. Well, There it is. I mean, does that sound like his writings at all?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, Mike, that's fascinating. Thank you so much. Now, another Easter egg character to dig into from history, Caroline Herschel. Got mentioned in the previous chapter. She's here in the background all the way through many of the chapters of the Mauritius Command because she's the inspiration behind Jack Aubrey getting deeper and deeper into astronomy and the thing with the Jupiter moons and the telescopes. She is another Easter egg character because she provides a great bridge between Jack Aubrey's love for practicalities in the Navy and his growing passion as a scientific sailor. In the book, Jack is obsessed with this new mirror, this 6-inch specular mirror. he credits her with handing along to him the expertise that he needed to figure the lens correctly using this stuff that he calls superfine Pomeranian sludge. And in the real world, Caroline Lucretia Herschel was every bit as rigorous as is described by Jack here. She was born in Germany, and she followed her famous brother William Herschel to England in 1759. And that's where the partnership between this brother and sister began. Now, it's easy to think of Caroline Herschel as just a sister or just an assistant, but she was a scientific force in her own right. She certainly did play the role, as society might have expected of a woman in the day, of being William Herschel's amanuensis, his note taker, performing the calculations in the background to make sense of his observations. But she was also a pioneer in her own right. She was actually the first woman to discover a comet. She went on to find 8 comets and 3 nebulae all by herself. And she did indeed pioneer the techniques of grinding and polishing mirrors that Jack describes. And by the time we meet her in what you might call the hypothetical years of the O'Brien timeline, she would have been in her 60s. So probably Sophie Aubrey's jealousy is misplaced had she but known how old Caroline Herschel really was. And she represents this an enlightenment characteristic of the supreme rational being, a perfectly ideal rationalistic thinker, the kind of person that Jack admires, that again, Jack can talk to about his newfound interest for sines and cotangents and seconds and the moons of Jupiter. And Mike, in the end, this brilliance of Caroline Herschel's paid off. In 1828, she was awarded the gold medal of the Astronomical Society. And it's a nice bit of foreshadowing, if you like, a nice bit of a plan and payoff for us as readers to realize that while Jack is pining for the sea at Ashgrove Cottage, he's associating with a woman whose name would literally be immortalized in the stars.
Yeah, it's really awesome. And, thanks, readers. When we were wrapping up chapter 1, we thought, well, we're out of time. We've got all this other stuff we want to talk about. And you called us right into it. We had already put little notes in that said, okay, in chapter 2, we got to remember to go back to this. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And to all listeners, by all means, please ping us on social media. We're going to try to jump back in more often for those great tips that you bring us and the questions here. So, Ian, we continuing on our journey in chapter 2 here, right?
Right. They're proceeding southwards down the Atlantic as observed in the sky. The journey, as we said, was recorded as being a happy period with this establishment of the nautical routine. The crew is settling in. We got all this nice period detail of the daily life and the daily routine aboard ship. For example, we get the detail of the purser nailing out 12 yards of white canvas duck being just a name for the canvas fabric, that the crew can use to make themselves fair weather clothes, white duck slops and hats. And this detail emphasizes the shift from the chaos of Plymouth and the cold, grim weather of the North Atlantic to the settled rhythm of the tropics and sea life. So much so that we get this great writing. At next Sunday's divisions, the landsmen, dressed in a mixture of rag-fair clothes and pursers' slops, old leather breeches, greasy waistcoats, and battered hats, had vanished, and their captain paced along lines of men as clean and white in their way as the Marines, drawn up on the quarterdeck, were clean and red in theirs. And I love this focus on shipboard routine. We're early in the canon here, so we're just learning to get O'Brien's voice in our heads with all these lovely tropes of the routine and the visuals and the poetry of life at sea. And it's a very nice contrast as well, all the clean color and light in contrast to the cabbages and the darkness.
Right.
Back at home.
Yeah, this is nice. There's so much of this stuff that's been awesome here. So we've got this routine settling in, but even though it's routine on the ship, Jack's mental state is anything but settled. We still have this command dynamics and Lord Clonfert hanging over him. So here's the essential quote on command. High command is something you come to suddenly with no experience, says Jack. He's explaining this to Stephen. They're captains under you, and each of them, God the Father on his own quarterdeck, and it's very different matter from handling a ship's company under your own eye. So we had alluded to this before the break, and here we are back to it because it's so important as we're starting to spin this story out.
Right. And it's a great piece of writing because it encapsulates the challenge that Jack is going to have. He loves drilling a crew and excelling at tactics. He has to lead other men, like the names we've already heard, Corbett and Pym and Clonfert. He says, you can rarely choose them, you can rarely get rid of them, and if you don't handle them right, the squadron's inefficient, and there's the devil to pay with tar. And by the way, the devil to pay with tar is a metaphor about taking care of a particularly difficult seam in the planking of a ship. Now, as a new reader, you might be alert to that. As an old hand, you might be thinking, oh yeah, I know about the devil to pay. But anyhow, we have this theme of leadership for Jack that's really universal, moving from excelling at your own craft on board your own ship to managing the egos and conflicting loyalties of others. And Mike, we're going to get another little literary Easter egg here, though. It's a pretty obvious one. Jack describes his struggle and compares it with that of Nelson. He says, Nelson could do it as easy as kiss my hand. And he refers to Nelson's famous band of brothers. And Nelson did indeed refer to his immediate group of fellow captains as a band of brothers. These were the captains under his command just before and at the Battle of the Nile back in 1798. And there are about 15 officers who were in Nelson's band of brothers. The most famous names in there were also names of people who went on to become distinguished officers in their own right. Hardy, Trowbridge, Miller, Hood, Thompson, and Saumarez, who appeared right back in Master and Commander. And this phrase, band of brothers, in fact, is one that Nelson borrowed of Shakespeare's St. Crispin's Day speech from the play Henry V. It's a really noble, stirring piece of writing that Nelson kind of acquires for his own uses in labeling his captains here, the band of brothers. Nelson wrote of his indignation and disappointment when he'd been passed over for a command of his own. He said, if I know my own thoughts, it is not for myself or on my own account chiefly that I feel the sting and the disappointment. No, it is for my brave officers, for my noble-minded friends and comrades, such a gallant set of fellows, such a band of brothers, my heart swells at the thought of them. So that was Nelson using the band of brothers. Let's hear my good friend Laurence Olivier telling us about the band of brothers in the original context in the play of Henry V.
Crispin Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, but we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so base. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day.
So we've got that big overarching source of tension, but we've also got an individual example of that, which is a little layered here. That's Lord Clonfert that we'd mentioned before, who Jack had encountered on HMS Agamemnon many years ago. So Jack recalls this, but doesn't tell Stephen about it. And Stephen, actually realizes that Jack is not telling him everything because he knows full well that Jack does not speak ill about his former shipmates. And Jack recalls this incident where Clonfert took credit for an action where Clonfert, in fact, had hung back while Jack and his folks had kind of pressed on and taken the risk boarding this ship. And Clonfert, his people and his boats were closer. Jack was committed. They heard a cheer from Clonfert's group. Clonfert's group, however, was cheering as spectators, not as actors here.
Right. And here's an optimistic presentation of the character of Clonfert. Clonfert is, in a way, an anti-Jack Aubrey. You might say, therefore, the perfect foil for Jack Aubrey's character. Jack is straightforward. He's a man of action. He's honorable. He has physical courage. And Clonfert is the shadow of all of that. He's a political maneuvering kind of person. He has ostentatious shows of culture. He's profoundly insecure, as we're going to hear. And it's interesting to speculate about where Clonfert might have come from. And there was a captain commanding the ship that Clonfert is written about having commanded, a guy called Nesbitt Willoughby. We might come back to Willoughby another time. I think in terms of the personality, though, the idealized, slightly extreme traits that we're talking about here are kind of like an idealized version of those shown in what you might call the dark side of the character of Thomas Cochrane. And as we know, Thomas Cochrane was the inspiration for Aubrey himself. The non-Aubrey-like parts of Thomas Cochrane, you might say, could be the inspiration for this odd character of Clonfert. So he's almost, you might say, Jack's alter ego, or for fans of Star Trek, you might say bad Kirk, or therefore, Mike, maybe even bad Cochrane.
Right. Well, this is interesting. And we see, as Stephen said, Jack's natural inclination is never to speak badly of his fellow shipmates. And I think he's thinking these thoughts, and he's almost trying to like compensate for it, because Stephen asks him about Clonfert, and Jack tries to put him in a good light, saying that, oh, well, he's got to be somebody good because he's a peer, an Irish peer, Stephen. So he must be a pretty good man. But in fact, Stephen sets him straight. Ian, tell us a little bit about Stephen setting Jack straight about Irish peers.
Well, cast your mind back to some of the things that we discussed about the peerage and the establishment in late 18th century Ireland with our guest Paddy Cullivan years ago now.
Right.
Stephen says, Irish peers are not all that you might suppose. He calls them a flash Brummagem imitation of the real thing. Brummagem is an odd word meaning from the city of Birmingham. And Birmingham used to be a place where things were manufactured cheap, in workshops on dark street corners. So to call something a Brummagem imitation means a cheap or a showy or a worthless imitation. This is massively underselling the manufacturing skills of the city of Birmingham, so I apologize to any Brummies who are listening. But the term originates from the 17th century practice of producing counterfeit coins in Birmingham. And again, to all the Brummies listening, we know that you don't do this anymore. But these coins, these Brummagem coins, were clearly poor quality, but shiny and impressive. So Clonfert here is being characterized by Stephen as an inauthentic or shoddy version of a great man who might otherwise merit a peerage. So this is not the only inauthentic artifact that's going to come up in relation to Clonfert's character. I'll just say narwhal tusk, and we'll come back to it in a later chapter, right?
Unicorn. Excuse me.
Right.
Right. Oh, gosh. Well, this kind of all brings us back to this extraordinary dynamic between Jack and Stephen. Stephen can now talk personally with Jack, not just about everything in the world that they generally talk about, but also about his other commanders, about people on the ship, because Stephen's in this new role as the designated political advisor, which I think is a great thing, because Jack talked so much in the books about, how being that captain, you're a man apart, a man alone. There's nobody you can talk to. And here, for once, he can talk to Stephen, which is really nice.
Right. And this is part of the aspect of Farquhar's character that makes it hard for Jack to like him, because he sees Farquhar and Stephen as having this particular little thing going on together that Jack can't be part of and doesn't really want to be part of. Stephen's function as advisor to the governor designate places him in this different role. And we see the difference here between Jack, the hubristic, sanguine, extroverted leader who's got to kind of knit this family together, and Stephen, who is there to simultaneously look after Jack, the captain, and also kind of take care of, arcane knowledge and stuff in the background. We saw that right at the beginning when Jack really wanted to leap out and weep and shake hands with Stephen, and Stephen wanted to kind of hang back and offer psychological support. So, Mike, it's really fun to see how Stephen and Farquhar, however Jack is feeling about this, they can still have their political and intelligence discussions. They have these discussions speaking foreign, as the text says, meaning they're speaking to each other, I guess, in Latin, so that the ship's boy can't listen in and the gossip can't be spread around the ship. Stephen was really worried about what you might call operational security. Stephen was really worried at the beginning of the book, and had been worried all the way through the first three books, about his role and his intelligence job becoming publicly spoken about. And it's very characteristic of him that he turns to speaking Latin and going into little huddles with Farquhar so he can protect his identity and his status a little bit here.
Absolutely. And I love that. I love that. And, I think we hear it in every book about how everybody on the ship can hear everything else that's going on everywhere else. And Stevens figured that out early on and defends against it here. Well, again, like first chapter, so much here that we can't talk about, don't have time to fit it all in. We look forward to your comments about things that perhaps we missed or that you wanted a little more depth on, but we can't end without that great moment between Jack and Stephen at the very end of the chapter. As Jack and Stephen are talking together. They're out in the boat. They've kind of rowed out. Jack likes to get away from kind of the mess of the ship and out far enough into the waters to take a little bit of a swim here. And Stephen, see Jack stripping down as they're talking and getting ready to dive in, has to stop as his friend and as his medico and give him a little bit of advice. Can you give us that speech from Stephen? I love this.
I love reading out Stephen quotes. They're really fun to read out. I cannot advise it, said Stephen. You are very corpulent, full of gross, vicious humours after these weeks and months of Poirier's cooking. And now we're come to the point, my dear, it is my clear duty to warn you against ghoul, against ungoverned appetite, a brutish vice, inductive mainly to the sin of Eve. Ah, bullimy, bullimy! Dinners have killed more men than ever Avicenna healed. He prosed away, while Jack took off his trousers. So you are determined on your bathe, he said, looking at his naked companion. Will you let me see your back now? He ran his fingers over the dull blue scar and asked, Do you feel it these days?
Wow.
And earlier on in the chapter, I think he was just kind of roasting Jack, but he's doing something a bit deeper than a roast here, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. I mean, you've got this great, hilarious friends poking fun at each other, plus some genuine concern over on Stephen's part. But it moves from this erudite that we said, Jack doesn't like in Farquaad, but he'll take it from Stephen here, and this medical preamble, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, a little nod, turns into a quiet moment of physical checkup, this physical reminder of a past wound, of the mortal danger sometimes, and this transformation from this pedantic humor to this deep shared affection that really demonstrates this emotional trust and mutual concern that forms the heart of the friendship between Stephen and Jack. And in a true O'Brien fashion, we get this fabulous moment. We're paused right there. And then we have to say, okay, we've got to move on. And Jack wraps up the chapter with a look and perhaps a little foreshadowing of what's coming. Jack is trying to get Stephen to jump in with him here. Stephen, bathe while you may, for tomorrow we reach the cold current setting north, the green water in the westerlies. I trust you will have your mollyhawks and your pintados and maybe your albatrosses, but there will be no more swimming till the Cape. So Jack back at Stephen going, just like Stephen's poking fun at Jack, Jack's poking fun at, you should swim now in this milk-warm ocean, and you might see some great birds on the rest, but there's not going to be any more chances to swim. So you love what you love. I love what I love. And we've got a turn coming up. Thank you, O'Brien. Again, we're like, end of chapter 2. I can't wait to flip that page over next time.
Mike, it's great, isn't it? What a great moment. The chapter concludes. The Boadiceas making progress towards their primary destination, which is Cape Town. We've got a prize. We've got some new characters. We've got this deepening relationship again between Stephen and Jack. And ahead of us is the nearest British naval station to the strategic French-held islands of Mauritius and La Réunion. That's Cape Town. We're leaving the warm waters and heading into colder climes. Any foreshadowing here? I guess we'll have to wait and find out in our next episode. Mike, what do you say to just a little bit more of this excellent Patrick O'Brien?
Oh, I should like that of all things.